Welcome to the 29th Annual Massachusetts Multicultural Film Festival presented by the Film Studies Program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm Laura McGough, curator of this year's festival, together with festival directors Daniel Pope and Sean Shimpak, and our stellar assistant curator, Nefeli Forney. Nefeli leads our team of undergraduate interns, Chaya Leibowitz, Lucy St. Sever, Yang Yin Chin, Shen Yu Wu, Ryan Curtis, and Samuel Cove. Thank you for your work. The theme for the 2022 festival is Indigeneities, proudly presenting a season of global contemporary Indigenous film and media art. Over the past decade, Indigenous cinema has emerged from geographically scattered and locally based production centers to become part of a globally linked media network with increasing reach and transnational presence. Indigeneities explores how contemporary Indigenous filmmakers and media artists leverage moving image forms to directly address the politics of identity and representation. The films screened this season address indigeneity or Indigenous identity through a range of cinematic genres: animation and 16mm film, hybrid documentary and feminist philosophy, historical reenactment and science fiction, both engaging and challenging the dominant mainstream media forms. It is our pleasure to welcome Danis Goulet to the festival to discuss her new film, Night Raiders. Danis Goulet is a writer and director whose films have been celebrated at film festivals around the world, such as Sundance, the Berlinale, and the Toronto International Film Festival. She has developed her work with the support of the Sundance Institute, the National Screen Institute, and the TIFF Talent Lab. Her film Wakening screened at TIFF and Sundance, and her film Barefoot was recognized with a special jury mention at the 2013 Berlinale. She has been a programmer for the Toronto International Film Festival and director of Imagine Native Film and Media Arts Festival. Danis is also a member of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Her debut feature, Night Raiders, was selected for the Sundance Institute's inaugural Talent Forum in 2019. Danis is Cree-Métis, originally from northern Saskatchewan in Canada. I'm pleased to present Santi Fraser, who provided the introduction to the film, and who will lead the conversation with Danis and moderate our question and answer period tonight. A member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, Santi Fraser earned a BFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts and an MFA from Syracuse University. His first collection of poems, Dark 30, was published in the Suntrack series of the University of Arizona Press. His honors include a fall 2009 Lannan Residency Fellowship and 2011 School Advanced Research Indigenous Writer in Residence. And he was the 2014 Native Arts and Cultural Foundation Literature Fellow. His second collection of poems was released in 2019 by the University of Arizona Press. Santi and Danis, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about the film. I had many thoughts. I picked it up through iTunes when I first heard about this, and I was really excited. And we all viewed it as a family. I live on Onondaga Nation. My wife and I married through Longhouse, and my two kids were there. And it was a really interesting experience because generally I'm used to some kind of explanation or context about the indigenous cultures that are in the film, right? That seems to be always a part of a first act, right? In a film where usually the audience, I would say the non-native audience, where there's something that's written into the film, some kind of exposition that explains these are the native people, these are the issues that we're going to talk about in the film, and so on and so forth. And I think we were all pleasantly surprised that it was really just about the narrative, the story, and experiencing the world that you created in the film. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because I feel like there's often this performative sort of aspect, right? Whenever you think about indigenous people in film, also happens in literature, so on and so forth. And, maybe not like a direct question, but I was just curious if you could maybe discuss some of those choices in the first act.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Santi. It's great to be here, and especially with you. And I just want to say Kinanaskamutin for having me. Yeah, it's a great. It's. Thank you for that observation. I think because we have, as Indigenous people, been so marginalized within mainstream media for so long. We're up against 100 years of cinema history that has not only underrepresented us, but also misrepresented us at every turn. And so I feel like every Indigenous filmmaker is sort of trying to undo something or correct something. And I think we're up against enormous pressure as well, that pressure of representation. And obviously, mainstream culture has created narratives about it, but there's also just the fact that mainstream culture is dominant. And so I think often Indigenous people feel the need to over-explain the cultural elements or the culture or the people or those contextual pieces that you're talking about. And I wanted to center Indigenous people, and specifically, this is a Cree story. I'm Cree-Métis from the Midwest of Canada, and there are Cree and Cree-Métis characters in the film. And I just wanted to center that as the context. And in the same way that the dominant culture never explains itself to us, it just is. And that's what colonization is. It's all encompassing, it's overbearing, it presses down, it affects every element of our lives. And so when you're trying to push back against that, I think you just, it's almost like a declaration of, in the same way you don't explain yourself to me, I feel no need to explain yourself to you. And so it just really is. And it's not to say that I was trying to not invite audiences in, because I think, hopefully everyone just jumps right into the story, and then it's kind of propulsive and you're sort of going along with it. But I was really hoping that I could just center the characters, center the people, and also that culture just is. And there is no need to explain it. So you don't have to say, when someone's pouring a cup of tea, these are our medicines, this tea comes from here, or whatever, unless it's, relevant to the characters of the story. The film will just have all of those elements. And some of it is absorbed by the audience, and maybe some of it isn't. And some of it is just absorbed by the Indigenous audience that gets some of those reference points. And that's kind of cool too.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking when you were responding there, it's that's actually just good filmmaking too. I mean, the best exposition, I think, in an opening of a film is no exposition at all, right? You're telling a story through moving images. And I think there is that pressure to explain things, or even in a way, the pressure as an Indigenous person to be understood and having my perspective understood, right? And especially in, in contexts where I'm not, in a Native community, right? And I think it's always really interesting because I go back and forth from Onondaga Nation to here every week. And there's always that sort of contrast where I feel like I'm always explaining things in Indigenous issues here. But then whenever I go back to Onondaga, I just feel the relief of not having to explain any of that and just kind of exist. But I was just really also sort of curious about this sort of idea, and I read a lot of interviews, and I read reviews of the film, and congratulations on the 11 nominations for the Canadian Film Awards. I think that's kind of amazing.
Thank you.
But I was just kind of thinking about it. The word dystopian and futurisms and things like that kind of popped up, and I sort of questioned that, because in a way I feel like Indigenous people are living in a dystopian future, right? And in some ways, maybe, in thinking about it, maybe our version of the world pre-European contact, right, ended at that, when European settlers arrived, and then sort of changed our minds about how we see the land, how we see ourselves, how we see our knowledges. And in some ways, the film felt very contemporary to me. Even though it's 20 years into the future, But I also feel like a lot of my experiences aren't all that different as an Indigenous person, and growing up the way that I did aren't that much different than the choices that Niska had to make for her daughter. And then also because I grew up sort of mostly institutionalized and also went to boarding schools, which are very different now and also very different in the US. But whenever I was actually started living in Onondaga, and it's a very living on a reservation, right? I really had to learn how to be into that community in many ways, as Niska did, right? And going into the second act. And so I don't really have a question for that, but related to that, but those were kind of my thoughts, right? Where, like, in some ways the word dystopian, I think, associates to maybe a Western way of life, but I think that's kind of been our reality for hundreds of years, I think at this point.
Well, yeah, because I think, and if you look back in cinema too, there's so much fear in films made about like the aliens coming to get us and colonize us and take us away. But you're so right that has, like, almost the worst thing that you could imagine has already happened. And to me, really, one of the worst things you could possibly imagine is when they come for your children. Like, that is every parent's and every community's worst nightmare. And it is an incredibly effective tool of colonization, because the fracturing of families causes intergenerational trauma, as we all know. And the residential school system up here in Canada, but I know there was also a similar system in the US, was a system here that was in place for 7 generations of Indigenous families. And the last one only closed in 1996. So this is not ancient history. It really is very much a part of our lives in the now. And that this reality, it does feel dystopian. And I know that there's been some academics and folks that, focus on Indigenous futurism that have talked about, Indigenous people having already lived through the apocalypse. And I think that's a compelling idea. But I also think that, there has also been, for me, the film really centers around love at the same time. And that Niska coming back into her community is the experience of so many people because of, other strategies of fracturing communities, which is by like relocating, even the reserve system was a massive relocation of people all over North America. And so there's so much fracturing of folks that need to find a way to reconnect and don't necessarily feel at home even in their home. And Niska's certainly one of those people, and also because she's been in survival mode for so long, it's like she just simply doesn't trust anybody. It doesn't matter if they're her own people or not. But I think part of what I was trying to say in the film too is ask the question, what does it mean not only to survive, but to thrive? And part of, I think, the answer to that question has to do with love. It has to do with community, and it has to be, that we are deserving of those things, like healthy communities, healthy families, love, and to know that you're deserving of love, I think, is a very fundamental thing. And I don't think that the character Niska knows that, which is also just a part of the way that trauma, blocks, in her case, her ability to let love in a way, or recognize care and warmth when it's right in front of her.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it makes me think of a quote from an interview that I read. And I wonder if you could speak to, in terms of like directing, but the quote is, in an Indigenous context, you're often asking people to dig into their own lived experience, which comes with a lot of pain. And I just, as an Indigenous director, I would imagine that you're able to speak to that more so on the set and guiding the actors, so on and so forth, as compared to, I think that would be a lot different if it were a non-native director, not really understanding, right, that many of the films about Indigenous people are sort of rooted in this realism, or they're meant to be true to life. And so they may not have that empathy, right, when it comes to directing Native or Indigenous actors. But I just wonder if you could speak to that process a little bit, because I think that that's an important point, and also very much very important in relation to Indigenous cinema, so on and so forth, as there begins to be more movies and things that are produced, so on and so forth. But I think we're really at an interesting time. But I think that one thing, right? How do you direct that, and how do you deal with that complexity and that pain on the set?
Yeah, I think the first thing you do is I think there's a power in declaring a space, an Indigenous space. And I think film sets are often, alienating hierarchical spaces. And although we can never undo that, which is a film set culture that's been put in place for many years on one film, we can endeavor at least to push back on it in the ways that we can. And one of the ways that we made sure to push back on it is by incorporating cultural practices in the shooting of the film. So, involving elders and opening us in the right way, but also making sure that smudges, which are cleansing practices for those who don't know, and things like that were available to the actors and also to me when we got to difficult places. And also, we did experience things where we had someone, like one of the actors on set had a trauma response to a scene we were shooting. And I just formed a wall around her and just said, we're just going to give you space. And, it's quite a thing to bring a huge film set to a halt, but it's sort of a commitment to just do it in the right way, to say, we're not going to tackle the scene or do this if we can feel it's wrong. And intuitively, if I felt something was wrong, or I could feel the actors, I would just check in and say, is everything okay? And if it wasn't, then it was just a matter of just determining what we needed. And sometimes it was a smudge, sometimes it was a break. And I remember once the first AD coming up to me to get one of the actors, and I just put my hand up and said no. And because we had these conversations in advance, he just walked off. He didn't even, there was no pressure. And I think, what it speaks to is endeavoring to be a values-driven project, where you're saying, we'll never change everything all in one film, and there's still going to be issues and challenges, but at least we can say when we come to junctures where we're called upon to make decisions about how to move forward, that we try to do it from a values-driven place, instead of the classic way the industry does it, which is what's the bottom line, or other considerations that might trump the safety of the space that we're all working in. And then I just really worked, obviously, to build trust with the actors so that they knew they had ownership over the space, because when they are bringing their lived experience to the film, and especially when it comes to residential schools, which has been hugely traumatic for so many people, including many of the actors that were working, is you have to go so carefully forward. And so I think, for me, it was just communicating that I am holding the space and we're holding the space together. And there was also so much laughter on the set, and so much such a sense of community. And I think, and so that was also just it's so healing and wonderful to be together. So as much as there were hard moments, there was also just amazing, fun, goofy, tricks and whatever kind of moments. But I think, when I first started as a filmmaker, I really started as a filmmaker because I was so frustrated by misrepresentation. I didn't ever think, I can be a director, I can tell stories, this is my dream and I'm going to go do it. I actually worked in casting, and I had a horrible experience in a casting room where there was a bunch of Indigenous women being called into this room for a big US television pilot. And it was like a Pocahontas type character who was coming into the room, silently standing there over a waterfall, and then sacrificing herself. So all these wonderful, incredible actors, one by one, came into the room. They were silenced, and then they died over and over again. And as a young person in the industry, I just thought this is just going to keep happening unless we are in key creative roles. And I looked around and said, like, who's going to do this? And it was like, well, I guess I'll give it a try. But we were so concerned with representation. But I think as soon as I started working, I realized that there are a lot of process questions that come up, that yes, we want to change what ends up on screen, but as Indigenous filmmakers, we also want to change the way we do this. And I think that, goes back to the values.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, this sort of idea of embodying the values set forth in the film, right? And also, I think it also speaks to this sort of idea too, is that, there's, I think, a way that Native actors and Native people have been exploited in film, especially, projects that are largely run by non-natives. And then, but then what does it mean when you have an Indigenous director, right? I feel like there would be a more sort of appreciation for the actual art of acting and giving them that space to sort of to be unrestricted, so to speak, right? And to be able to, for the actors and others to be able to express themselves in the way that they need to. And I think that's always, I feel like that's I think about the classroom a lot, and how, Native people have been overtly oppressed, right? And, via Western education. And I think about myself entering in the classroom, and how do I not repeat those, how do I not oppress my students in the way that Native people have been oppressed? How do I design assignments and classes, right, that don't oppress them and that allow them to be themselves and to be vulnerable and to be individuals, right? And I think that takes a lot of work, but I don't think it's necessarily work that it has to be done specifically in an Indigenous communities. But I do think that even in my experiences here at UMass Amherst, setting those values, setting forth those values in the classroom, I think all of the students who are largely non-native really appreciate that, right? You don't know you're oppressed until someone reveals it to you. So
no, it's
I really
so
appreciate
true.
you saying that.
Yeah,
Sorry,
and
go
I
ahead.
think it just got me thinking about I think in the context of well, I think there are many sort of Euro-Western ideas about leadership and what it means to sort of like be in a position of authority. And I think when it comes to film, there's like a big reverence for auteur theory, where there's like one person holding a vision, which I'm not a huge fan of that. I think that film is incredibly collaborative, and the types of collaborators that I like to work with are bringing their own vision and meeting my vision, and that we're building something new together. And to me, that's a beautiful collaboration, and I have so much respect for what they're bringing. And then I think also when it comes to actors, there's this idea, like you've heard so many stories about, notorious directors that control performance, or like make someone do 200 takes, or like, to the point of like even abusive stories on set, where it's all about the director knows exactly what they want, and they're like going to do everything to get it, even if it means abusing people. And I go into the process with hopefully an openness, which is that I may have ideas about where I want it to go, but I also would love to be open to the discovery of what's going to happen when we get there together. And so to me, it's all about building the space, or like the sandbox that we're going to play in. And also, I think play is such a powerful thing. And I think, I really saw it in my early short films. I sort of looked to the theater community and like started looking at theater models that were working with oppressed communities, because that kind of work where you bring people together and engage them in play, or even just like moving your body, it can be so powerful. And I was speaking to my friend Helen Haig Brown, who was the co-director of a film called Edge of the Knife, which is a film that was shot up here in an unceded territory in the west coast of Canada, called, it was an all Haida language film. And Haida is an endangered language. There's only 25 speakers left in the world. And she said that, and it was produced by Isuma, which are the filmmakers from the far north between Atanarjuat, the Fast Runner. And they've developed this model of working with communities. And she said when she asked Isuma about their model, they said, we endeavor to be unobstructive. And I just thought that was so beautiful to think of a director who's unobstructed. Like, it's the polar opposite of everything we've been taught about what directors are supposed to do. And I just thought it was beautiful and inspiring.
That's really, yeah, that's really interesting. And in some ways, when you start thinking about it, like these things seem so complicated, but really simple ideas, right? Don't be mean on the set, you know, or
Yeah.
any of those things. Like, I think it's like a lot of that. I feel like it's just really interesting how just indigenous values, how they can be sort of folded into some of these different structures. But I wanted to go to a question from the audience, which I think kind of fits into what you were just talking about. And the question is, I'm interested in the transnational aspects of this film, an international cast, a Canada-New Zealand production. Can you please discuss the aspects of the film and how it impacted the production?
Yeah, sure. So I think a lot of people had been dreaming about international Indigenous co-productions for years, and we had seen it happen between circumpolar people in the Arctic. But this was the first international Indigenous co-production between Canada and Aotearoa, which is New Zealand. I had always sort of dreamed about that. And so very early in the film, in the writing process, I wrote this Maori character into the film, who is now played by Alex Tarrant, the Leo character. And I took it to my friend who's a screenwriter down there, and I said, what do you think? And does this feel authentic in this world? And because you don't sort of want to just tack it all together. But one of the things that I was inspired by is the global Indigenous sovereignty that is so often expressed between various Indigenous nations. And I traveled to Standing Rock when that was all happening and erupting. And it's so beautiful when you drive into the entrance for Standing Rock. It's flanked by 200 flags of, or hundreds of flags of Indigenous nations who are there in solidarity. And when there was a moment when the pipeline was blocked, I remember listening to the live feed of one of the Indigenous environmental organizations. And the first thing they did was thank the Maori delegation for coming up and standing in solidarity. And I'd never really seen that reflected on screen before. And so it was this idea that this character who had some kind of like privilege to travel would use his privilege to help and be adopted into this Cree community. And so I feel like that naturally happens in our communities, but I wanted to reflect that. And also the global Indigenous film community has been meeting up for many years. And I think that's a community that I've been really a part of and inspired by. And there are certain film festivals that people go to, and certainly Imaginative, which is one that I've been involved in many years, is like a global meeting point. So a lot of the folks that I ended up working with from New Zealand, like we had met up at Imaginative or elsewhere over the years. So those relationships were really organic when we wanted to like formalize it as a co-production. So we had Alex come up, we had some crew come up, we had New Zealand producers, and then we did a lot of posts down there as well. So the majority of the VFX work was done there, and the sound work as well, and the music.
That's really interesting. But I could see that looking, or at least collaborating with filmmakers and from other Indigenous communities, right, would allow you also to gain some insight on production challenges and how to actually get a film made, because I think that's a largely like one of the biggest issues is trying to get projects like Night Raiders and others funded, and also being able to produce something that that is well made, well crafted, right, that has all of the things that the audience needs to immerse themselves in these worlds. And I think that a lot of the times, right, I think depending on where you are, I think it can be really difficult to get a film made like that. And so I really think that that's an interesting thing. And I feel the same way with poets, right, and others, right? There's certain kinship that you have through the challenges that you face in making your art and being an artist. So let me go to a different question here. So can you speak about the casting process and the value in casting Indigenous individuals in roles built around their culture and in stories about their experiences. How can more productions be respectful toward Indigenous representations in film?
Yeah, so yeah, the casting was amazing. I knew Elle-Máijá through I actually knew her as a filmmaker more than an actor, and so she just sent her audition in, and I was like, "Oh my God, I forgot she was an actor." And when I did the callback, she just like blew it out of the water. Like it was incredible. I was in tears. And then for Wasis, who was played by Brooklyn Letexier Hart. We found her in Winnipeg, but we had been scouring North America and seen about 300 kids. And we worked with a casting director out of the US, Renee Haynes. She was found by a local casting director in Winnipeg, and she actually came in for a smaller role. And as soon as I saw her, I was like, oh my God, we got to bring her in for Wasis. And then Alex was found through our New Zealand team. And then Gail Maurice, who plays Ida, the camp leader, is an actor I've worked with in the past. And I love her. She speaks Cree as her first language. And so someone that both has the language and is also just incredibly talented actor. I mean, you just cannot ask for more in one person. And so, yeah, like casting Indigenous people, like that understanding that they have about the world and about the story that we're telling just has so many layers and so much depth. And we have an Indigenous Screen Office up here in Canada, which was established about 5 years ago, and their mission is to support what's called narrative sovereignty. And that is the right for Indigenous people to have control over their storytelling, recognizing that the history of stories have been largely made without us, and that often those stories are problematic, or sometimes they're not overtly racist, but they still subtly sort of serve a certain agenda. And the rallying cry of that particular organization is always nothing about us without us. And I think we're coming into a new era where, it's not just about correcting the wrongs of the past and the fact that it's absolutely the right thing to do, that we're really seeing it in the quality of the films themselves. And I think we're in the midst of kind of an explosion of work that we've seen in the last few years by filmmakers like Tracy Deer, who made a film called Beans, or like even Reservation Dogs by Sterling Harjo, which is like widely out in the world right now and like breaking so many barriers, or like Rutherford Falls. It is no like coincidence that these shows are run by Indigenous people, because that lived experience and the depth of understanding and knowledge actually lends itself to amazing storytelling. Surprise, surprise, a secret we've known all along. So like questions of authorship for me, and also working with Indigenous actors are always about the fact that this benefits storytelling and craft and is expansive, not restrictive.
So when you were talking about the casting, I had a sort of a moment that I felt like was really interesting in the film, in the second act, where the scene where Wasis is putting the rifle together, or assembling the rifle, and then that sort of moment of violence when she attacks Victoria, and the way that the authority figures in that scene were looking on. And I guess I would just really be interested in sort of your thinking behind that, because I felt like it was a really interesting sort of gesture or statement in terms of how, in many ways, Native people, Indigenous people, and many others that have been colonized are seen through that sort of lens of violence, or as savages, or as primitive, and that that through that sort of Western teaching and order, that we're able to suppress those things that are inherently like within us. And I think about the phrases like off the reservation. I think about the way that Native culture was described, right, by different European I guess I think they call them explorers. But I was just wondering if you could talk about that sort of moment, because I felt like it was really important, at least for me when I saw that. And yeah, I'd just be really interested to hear your take.
Yeah, I mean, like that moment is very much like it is violent and it's a manipulation on the part of those who are holding the authority. But also Wasis has grown up in the bush, and she like there's a scene where the girls are playing and she's like drawing a map to like get her, like she's mapping her escape out of there. And it's subtle, and sometimes you only hear it in the theater, but one of the girls says, "I don't want to sleep next to the bush girl." And it's like very much playing on that idea of the savage, or the fact that our people, and my dad grew up hunting and trapping in a very traditional way, and the skill set is incredible. And the fact that it was so undervalued, and continues to be undervalued in terms of what the indigenous skill sets are out there in the land, or like even traditional knowledge continues to just be overlooked. And it's like, and what it is white supremacy, right? It's like our way is always better. And I think also it was white supremacy and in the values of competition, where, if you look at different authoritarian leaders, and we're certainly seeing, an uprising of all of that, and have been for quite some time, that is affecting people very much right now. But you see, like, not only is it violent, but it also it relies on competition, and it relies on violence. And so, the authoritarian figure in that scene, which is the headmaster, she is all about pitting those girls against each other. The more the better, because the person who is the best, who is going to emerge as the winner, is the one that is willing to resort to violence. But also that violence comes out from Wasis as in response to the manipulation of the previous scene, where she's just been shown, she's been manipulated by the headmaster to believe that her mother abandoned her. And so it's like awakening that kind of anger and sowing the seeds of sort of like that kind of anger that would make you pit. And by the way, I also cast Victoria as a person of color, a young woman of color, on purpose, to really show when marginalized communities get pitted against each other, which is the exact opposite of the values of solidarity. So to me, it's so tragic, right? It's like she's doing exactly, it's like the headmaster setting up the situation and then, like letting it play out. And it's really tragic and awful.
Yeah, and I also just like to point out that Native and Indigenous people, and especially I think Indigenous women, are always put in that situation daily. I think it's not so drastic as it is in the film, but I think that these things are constantly happening, right? Because there's this sort of expectation of how we're supposed to behave in different in different sort of what you would say, like environments that are built on a certain type of order, right? And so whoever can perform and be the most assimilated is the person that wins. And I think that's a very cruel game. I think that in some cases, I don't think many Native people are aware of that. And I think that the film brings that to relief in such a way, and it's so subtle. I think that moment was just probably my favorite moment of the film. But also, and I wonder if you could speak to a little bit of how you sort of folded in Indigenous knowledge, right, and understandings of the land, which I think has largely been, or at least that's one of the things that was erased. When Niska returns to her community and you see the flattening of the leadership structure, but then also you see how, within that community, how everyone is being taught about different plants and those things, and it's done in such an organic way. And I guess one is like a sort of a filmmaking question, how did you go about shooting that and creating that sort of scene and that feeling through the camera? And then also, how did you sort of think about, the content itself and folding it into the filmmaking process?
Yeah, I think I'd been inspired by so many real life examples of the way that communities are engaging in revitalization projects, because it's like, I always think of that saying, my existence is resistance, where it's like, as Indigenous people, it's like you exist just to fight, because what options do we have under colonization? And the fight is exhausting, and it always takes. And I've really in the last little while become very interested in those who engage in not just healing, but also nation building and revitalization. And I am not a Cree speaker, but my dad is a Cree speaker. And the elder that you see in the camp that's actually teaching them about the plants is my dad. And so, we've seen in our communities like different culture camps and language camps. And I've been lucky enough to go to a Cree immersion camp every summer for the last few years now. I think I'm now doing it online. But it's so beautiful to be in those spaces, like to be on your homelands and to be amongst your people and to hear your original language, especially if you've lost it, is so powerful. And there's nothing in life that is quite like it, because we're so enmeshed in the fight in so many other arenas of life. And so I wanted the camp in the film to really have that quality of it, where you really feel everyone's contributing, everybody has their place, everyone has their skills that are valued. The children that they have like liberated out of the academies are now brought into this community of learning the language and learning about the land. And there's such a beauty and sense of community in all of that. And then in the way that we shot it, I mean, the whole film in a way is like, very tactile, and it's got like sort of like a moving camera. And so, it's a goal, like as a storyteller, to never have any of those things come across as didactic. So it's like, but that education piece of like passing down knowledge to the younger generations is such a beautiful thing. And so I just wanted to portray it in a way, but hopefully without it feeling didactic, so that we're always moving through spaces in this very organic way. And also through, Niska's experience of being in the camp for the first time. Yeah.
That I think it does come across that way. I was actually really appreciated that, because again, there would always be like some kind of like setup in a film, like where we're about to talk about, this, and there's like a language, and it does feel like didactic in the way that it's set up. And I feel like that's, I don't know, I really appreciate that, because I don't feel like I'm, I just experience it and I can appreciate it. And I think that that's a really difficult thing to do. So I really respect that. And also just this sense of, and you're talking about this, that the whole thing with giving in the film, giving your children over to the state so that they can have a better life. The irony is that Niska stumbles back into the better life, right? In the end, right? A sort of more accepting, inclusive, and in kind community. And I think that that's one of the things also that I appreciate, right? Is that people really view, right, Native communities and reservations through the lens of, right, Hollywood film, especially in the golden age and in other ways. And they always see these as tragic communities. And I never, I don't ever see it that way, maybe because I'm in it, but I always feel like Native communities, there's, they, maybe economically depressed, and I don't really know what that means, but I always feel a lot of comfort, and like no one goes hungry on, in Onondaga Nation, like no one goes hungry. There's just all of these things to where you have a system of support, right? That is, I feel like is always there and with you. And I don't think that a lot of films portray that, but I felt like Night Raiders did a really good job of that. So little
Thank
subtle
you
things.
so much. Yeah. And it's such a big part of, I guess that whole question of representation is, what is it to be in our communities? Like when I go home, like I'm, like the laughter of my aunties is just like everywhere. And it's like my parents' house has like a steady stream of like wild meat and fish like coming through, like everyone just like comes around, drops off the stuff, like it's just such a community of sharing and Of course, there's all of the issues and all of those things that we experience, but you're right. It's so rare to sort of catch glimpses of the joy in community.
Hmm. Yeah, this sort of thing that Western education leads to a better life, and it teaches you to hate your home and never return to it. That's still going on, right? I feel like that still happens, that people feel like they can't be home. And I was talking with Ryan Redcorn, who's loosely associated with, Reservation Dogs, and he talked about
Mhm.
the value of having his business, and also, which is Buffalo Nickel Design, and they do film work and those kinds of things, but having that business in his nation, right? And because for one, it helps him to be close to home so his kids can learn language, but also I think that Native people, they need those things in their community to see those things, right? It might be really hard to do that, but I think it's also, I think that's, I don't know, it just speaks to a shift in the values, I think, over in the last 20 years that I see. But I think maybe we have maybe one time for one more or two more questions. I don't quite know. 5 minutes to wrap up last questions. Okay. All right. So let's see. I'm looking here. This is a pretty good question. How is the film received in Canada in the context of the legal battle around seizing children from families and placing them in institutions? So I think the current controversy associated with residential schools and how that's very much a part of the I guess the political discourse and dialogue in Canada, right? But I guess how does film, or how has it maybe been situated in that particular discourse? I may have went too academic there. Sorry.
No, it's all right. So up here in Canada, we've had a body called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was formed to investigate, residential schools, because this was very much erased in our history. So it wasn't talked about, it wasn't acknowledged. And people spoke up about this history. And then it led to this, the founding of this body that released their findings. I guess it was maybe 5 years ago now. And it really changed the consciousness in Canada of what happened. And one of the things that they said when it came out was that a child going into a residential school had a greater chance of dying than a Canadian soldier did going into World War II. So it just gives you a context for how awful these environments were, how abusive, how malnourished. There were nutritional experiments done on children. And so, for me, when I endeavored to make this film, it's because I didn't really see that conversation happening enough. And I think there was a lot of fatigue around this topic, which was like, oh, certainly it wasn't that bad, or like, why do we have to keep hearing about this? And so also that was part of my choice to make it as a genre film, was just to offer sort of like a fresh way in. But when the film was released, it came at a time where this past summer, a lot of news headlines were coming out because communities had started to engage in the process of uncovering the graves of children that our communities always knew were there, but that they were actually finding the evidence of it. And so there were a First Nation started this process in British Columbia near Kamloops, and they found, hundreds of children underground. And since then, many First Nations have followed suit, and it's an incredibly painful process. And so it was actually a kind of, we didn't expect that to be in the news as we were coming out, but it felt like, that there was still such a need for a reckoning. And that even though Canada had undergone this truth and reconciliation process, that, we really still were simply just grappling with the truth. Like what actually happened is one thing, and then having the ability to actually let it in, that kind of horror, and to actually admit that Canada as a colonial country was founded upon like the robbery and then violent deaths of Indigenous children. It's so awful and it's so painful for our communities, but I think for mainstream Canada, it's been very hard to let in. And so the film has come out as like a way of, I think, opening things up to like talk about these things. And yeah, it's been very well received up here so far. So I'm just really looking forward to that dialogue continuing.
Yeah, I think these I think a lot of these issues, I think they're very new, I think, and I think whenever you have an Indigenous person sort of leading, right, in this case you know, a film production, and instilling those values and sort of doing the opposite of what you just sort of articulated that happened in residential schools, I think is a really powerful sort of message to send across. And I also I feel like it's I think it's helpful for a lot of Indigenous people that are still experiencing these kinds of horrors in a real way. I think that we think that these sort of these things are in the past or their history, but you know, this type of thinking and this type of oppression is still very much alive in areas such as Bolivia, Brazil, on into Peru, so on and so forth. Those Indigenous folks down there are still sort of very much fighting to keep their way of life. And I think that that's one of the things that I think is really interesting about now in this film coming out now. I think it is helpful to other people sort of globally that are in those struggles too.
Yeah,
I feel
and
like
I would also point to, sorry, just one more thought, which is the
that's okay.
child welfare systems in the US and Canada are still taking Indigenous children away from their families. And everyone should listen to the second season of This Land, the podcast. It is absolutely incredible. And it's all about the adoption system in the US and what it is doing to Indigenous families, not only to take children away, but also to undermine Native sovereignty. It's completely compelling. So This Land, I was just so compelled when I listened to it.
Mm-hmm. And I always too, and I guess in just wrapping up, I think that all of these are very important conversations, but I also like to recognize, you know, just as a poet, because in some ways I see myself outside of these struggles, but I really, in Native communities, there are people that are dealing with these issues on a daily basis. And, you know, when we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, we're talking about residential schools, we're talking about the fight for sovereignty. There are as many public things that are sort of being you know, events like this and the films and other discussions that are happening. There are a lot of Indigenous people that are doing the quiet work, the groundwork within their communities to address these things on a daily basis. And so I always just like to address that, you know, at the end of a talk like this, you know, and I feel like as a poet and as, you know, in teaching, you know, I have a specific lens. And I always want to remind myself that when I return to, you know, to Onondaga, for instance, or even return home, that there are people that are doing that work every day. And sometimes that work takes a great toll on them, but it's important work, even though it may not be public.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Rebecca Neagle is amazing. That's from the chat.
Oh, yeah.
I love that podcast also. Yeah, and so Danis, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I'm honored to do so. I've always wanted to do a chat like this, and I really respect your work. But not only the final product, but how you make films, I think is quite inspiring to me. And I hope that I get to see a new film from you very soon.
Thank you, Santi. I really appreciated this discussion. And I find that whenever I'm in dialogue with other Indigenous people, it always ends up being my favorite talk. So I just wanted to thank you for your insights and your sharing and your knowledge. And yeah, it was just such a pleasure to be here with you, Kinaneskomtin. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Santi Fraser, for moderating this really fascinating and invaluable conversation tonight. And many thanks again to Danis Goulet for this impressive first feature film and for joining us to discuss it today. And to Laura Mago, curator of this season's MMFF, and Nefeli Fornis Budaki, assistant curator. Thanks also to our audience. Note that Night Raiders will be available on demand via our website tonight. If you've not been able to see it yet, or if you want to see it again, I wouldn't blame you. It's a pleasure to acknowledge and to thank our sponsors who make the 2022 MMFF possible. At UMass Amherst, that's the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, the UMass Arts Council, and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And special thanks to the 5 College Film and Media Council and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Please see our website for more information about the festival and for upcoming events. That's blogs.umass.edu/MMFF2022. The festival is presented by the Film Studies program at UMass Amherst, Barbara Zecki, Film Studies Director. I'm Daniel Pope, Director of the MMFF, together with Sean Shimpak. Thank you.